In a previous video concerning the ABCs of emotions, I discussed the fact that whenever we feel a feeling, three things happen. First, we become aware of something. That's the A in the emotional ABCs. Then we think or believe something about it. That's the B in the emotional ABCs. We think or believe something about this thing that we're aware of. And then we feel an emotional feeling and engage in the behavior. That's the C in the emotional ABCs, the emotional consequence. This emotional consequence is the result of what we think about what we're aware of. So the main message in that video is that it is our thinking that causes our feelings and behaviors, not people and things and situations and events. And I made the case in this video as to why it's so important to understand that and why it's such a good thing that indeed our thoughts cause our feelings and behaviors. So typically what cognitive behavioral therapists do after people understand the emotional ABCs or the so-called cognitive model of emotions is the therapist will have the client break down their, particularly their unwanted emotions and behaviors into the ABCs, to write them out. A, this is what I was aware of. B, this is what I thought about it. And C, this is how I felt and what I did as a result of what I thought about what I was aware of. Sometimes what happens though is a client will appear for a session saying, you know, I think I did a pretty good job with these ABCs, breaking down my reactions into the ABCs, except for this one situation. I wasn't quite sure how to break down my reactions into the ABCs. So they'll say, I knew what to write down in the A column, what I was aware of, that Joe called me a rotten so-and-so. And they'll know what to write down in the C column. They'll say, I knew what to write down in the C column, how I felt and what I did. I felt very angry, and what did I do? I punched him in the nose. But you know, it happened so quickly, I don't know what I thought. And it will give the person the impression that no thinking occurred. And it will also give them the impression that A caused C. All I know is he called me this name, and instantly my fist is on his nose. However, something that's very important to understand is that everything we do, everything, except for a very simple basic physiological reflex, like the doctor taps on your knee and your leg jerks, or that wonderful glaucoma test where they blow the air in your eye and you blink. Don't you hate that? Everything we do is preceded by a thought. That we cannot do anything without somehow giving our brain the signal to do it one way or another. And I say thank God for that. Because if that were not the case, we'd engage in random behaviors. Who knows what we would do if the brain did not require the signal from us to do it. For example, if you're sitting down, at some point you likely will stand up. When you stand up, it's not very likely that you'll spend much time thinking about actually standing up. Why? Because you are very good, I'm assuming if you're very good at standing from a seated position, you've done this just about all of your life, so now you don't have to think much about it consciously to do it. Okay? So everything we do is preceded by thought. So therefore, in the scenario that I mentioned, if he instantly felt angry and he punches him, we know the brain had to get the signal to make the body feel very angry and a punch. It's not going to happen on its own. And if it did, it wouldn't need Joe to call him a rotten so-and-so. So the question is, what is this signal the brain gets and gets very quickly to produce such an instant, rapid response? Well, we call this signal in rational living therapy, which is a cognitive behavioral approach, is a reflexive thought. A reflexive thought is a very well learned, very practiced thought. So practiced, so well learned that is now stored in the brain ready for action. So that the second the brain is reminded of this thought, it's triggered and off you go. You no longer need to think it consciously any longer. It is that practice, that well learned. Now, how does a thought get so well learned? Well, every time we think a thought, we practice that thought. Every time we're exposed to an idea, we're practicing that idea. So that after a while we become so skilled at thinking that way that we no longer need to think it consciously. Now, reflexive thoughts can be very helpful when they are well-learned rational thoughts that sometimes save our lives, protect us from harm. A reflexive thought is what enables you to slam on your brakes to avoid hitting the car in front of you. If you know how to type, you have a reflexive thought for every key in the keyboard. That's what makes it seem like your fingers have a mind of their own. Wasn't always that way though, was it? So reflexive thoughts are very helpful when they are well-learned rational thoughts. They are not so helpful when they are well-learned irrational thoughts that sometimes produce instant unwanted emotions and behaviors. Now, the very first person to come up with this concept of thought shorthand was Maxie Maltzby Jr. And Maxie calls what I call reflexive thought an attitude. Okay? However, in rational living therapy, we call this a reflexive thought. Now, so therefore, the person says, I was aware of this. I was aware that he punched me in the nose. And I was aware that instantly I felt very angry and I punched him. But I don't know what I thought. There is an excellent question to ask yourself in that type of situation to uncover the reflexive thought. And that question is, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking? Okay? What does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking? Now, the reason this question is relevant and useful is because the human body, when working properly, will always produce the logical reaction to what is thought in the brain. The body is a reflection of what is thought in the brain. The only time this is not the case is when there is something wrong with the body. For example, a person's depressive symptoms are the result of hypothyroidism. In that case, how they think and how they feel might be two different things. However, if everything's working properly, the body will produce a logical reaction to what is thought in the brain. I'm sure you've heard people say things like, gee, that reaction wasn't logical. Sure it was for how they thought. So if we apply this question, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking, to the scenario where Joe calls him a rotten so-and-so and instantly he feels very angry and he punches him, what does that behavior suggest that he was thinking? Well, what I teach my clients is that the more they understand the different kinds of thoughts that produce the different feelings and behaviors, the easier it will be for them to answer this question, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking? So that's why we take the time to explain this to them. For example, when people are very angry, and especially when they go out of their way to share their anger with others, like to punch them, there are two kinds of thoughts they're acting as though they're thinking. The first is a should type thought. You shouldn't have called me that name. Okay? And then the angrier a person is, the more violent their behavior, the more they're acting as though they're thinking a need type thought. I need you not treat me this way, like my life depends on it. Okay? So the more people understand the different kinds of thoughts that produce the different feelings and behaviors, the easier it will be for them to answer this question, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking? Okay. Now, what are some examples of reflexive thoughts in action? Well, if there's one thing that demonstrates a reflexive thought in action, it's panic. Right? That's what gives people the impression that it just happened, it came over me, I had a panic attack. Instant anger reactions are the results of reflexive thoughts and actions. So this so-called intermittent explosive disorder really just means a person is very good at angering themselves every now and then. Any kind of instant impulsive or compulsive behavior where a person swears that they did not think something consciously before they acted, they might not have had to consciously. Okay? So therefore, in therapy, we help people to uncover these reflexive thoughts with that question, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking? And then we help them to apply the rational questions, the three rational questions, which we'll produce another video concerning the three rational questions. We'll help them to apply those rational questions to those reflexive thoughts that we've uncovered. If we determine that a thought is irrational for the person, we will help them to develop a new rational replacement thought. We will have them practice that thought so that in the future, when they're in similar situations, this new way of thinking comes to mind, and therefore they have a new feeling and behavior as a result. Okay? So there's no doubt that it seems as though it just happens. But I'm very thankful that it doesn't just happen, because if it did, I would know what to do about it. Okay? So keep this in mind then. Everything we do is preceded by a thought. So the more that we understand the different kinds of thoughts that produce the different feelings and behaviors, the easier it will be to answer that question, what does my behavior suggest that I'm thinking?